A pitch is so much more than just the slides that you send over to an investor. It really is a reflection of you as a founder, right? Certainly at the earliest stages, and as you continue to grow as a company, you're being evaluated not just as an individual, you're being evaluated as a leader. And when an investor is listening to your pitch, they're thinking about how does this translate to the way that they tell their story to customers, when they're telling their story to potential employees, when they're telling their story to other partners. Is this the formidable type of person that I want to be backing with my capital?
Welcome to Startup Health Now, the podcast where we celebrate the entrepreneurs and innovators reimagining the future of health. I'm your host, Logan Plaster. Health transformers, what we call the entrepreneurs that we invest in and work with every day at Startup Health, didn't get into this business to create pitch decks. They didn't start their companies in order to have investor meetings. They wanted to solve big problems in health, to heal people and help them live longer. But the reality is that often in health startups, as in much of entrepreneurship, your ability to attract the necessary capital and talent hinges on your ability to tell your story. Whether it's through your verbal delivery or your presentation deck, it's essential that founders are able to frame the challenge effectively, inspire confidence in their team, and then drive action. This is precisely where my guest today, Jared Bloom, has spent his proverbial 10,000 hours. He's the co-founder of Fourth & King, an agency dedicated solely to helping companies craft, design, and deliver fundraising presentations. They've worked with more than 200 companies now, helping them raise a cumulative $7 billion in capital. The conversation you'll hear is excerpted from a fireside chat that was held in front of a live audience of founders from the Startup Health portfolio. So in addition to his general wisdom on nailing your next business presentation, you'll hear his answers to a range of tactical questions from the audience. Enjoy. Jared, really excited to have this conversation with you, and let's get into it. How are you doing today?
Doing great, thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, I'm excited. So I'm going to start by playing the devil's advocate and say, how important is a pitch deck really? Just for argument's sake, can't I just be a great founder who's has a great personality and explains what I'm building in a cohesive way? Why is this pitch presentation so critical?
Yeah, for my own good, I would hope it is important. And what we have found, is it true that a great business is going to raise capital? Yes, it's 100% true. And no pitch deck can overcome challenges that are too big for the business to overcome, and no pitch deck can rescue a company that doesn't belong in that next stage of capital. Pitch deck just simply can't do that. But why does a pitch matter? Our feeling on this is a pitch is so much more than just the slides that you send over to an investor. It really is a reflection of you as a founder, right? Certainly at the earliest stages, and as you continue to grow as a company, you're being evaluated not just as an individual, you're being evaluated as a leader. And when an investor is listening to your pitch, they're thinking about how does this translate to the way that they tell their story to customers, when they're telling their story to potential employees, when they're telling their story to other partners. Is this the formidable type of person that I want to be backing with my capital? And doing that with a pitch deck is often the only opportunity you have, right? That's the first impression that you're making as you're going to raise your next round. And there's also, it's unavoidable, right? The fact of the matter is that this is how investors evaluate companies, right? And they're looking at hundreds of deals every single year. And what we hear from investors all the time is that they're not lacking for good investment opportunities. They're looking for great investment opportunities. And it's the founder, it's their responsibility to position themselves to be not just, hey, this is an interesting company I want to look at. This is a company I want to invest my precious time in, to dig deeper. And the pitch deck is that first entree and your first opportunity to get into that type of relationship. So no, it's not going to make or break your company, but it may very well be the difference between you getting in front of the investor you want to and not.
Tell us a little bit about Fourth & King. What was the work you were doing at First Round that really caused you to spin this out, and why was that an important thing to do?
So Fourth & King is an agency that my co-founder Chris Laughlin and I started in 2014. We had been working together for a number of years before that at a presentation agency. Those do exist. where we were focused on every type of presentation you can imagine. We worked on TED Talks. We worked on those large corporate meetings you see at the Moscone Center out here in San Francisco. We worked on every type of sales or marketing deck you can imagine. And of course, being out in the Bay Area, we work with plenty of startups as well. Myself on the narrative and speech writing side, Chris working on graphic design and data visualization. And over the course of that time, we built up a number of relationships, both with investors and founders who basically told us, look, there's a huge opportunity here when you're talking about pitching, where what you have is, if you're a founder, you may have plenty of people out there who are willing to give you advice on your pitch. I can tell you that is very easy to find, but then going and implementing that advice is very challenging. There are also plenty of graphic designers out there who can take your bullets and clean them up and make them look professional. But trying to educate a designer on, say, the difference between ARR and MRR can be an uphill battle. So we saw it as an opportunity to really become experts in what it is investors were looking for and helping founders to connect with them through presentations. So leveraging our presentation experience with this sort of with this specific audience that we've spent the last 9 or 10 years really trying to understand. And so we work with companies from seed all the way through to IPO. Last year was the first time that we actually built the IPO deck for a company we had built a seed deck for, which was very exciting. And we also work with a number of funds as well on their fundraising. So we feel like we've developed a pretty strong understanding of all three sides of the table, right? The founder, the GP, the LP. And luckily, not too many companies have followed suit, and we've been able to put together a nice little niche here.
Well, I want to cut to the chase and jump right into what the critical components of a winning deck are. But perhaps a way to sort of get into that would be to take the negative and say, just to start us out, what are some of the critical mistakes that you have seen startups making as they think through their presentation deck?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are plenty of mistakes that we can talk about. I think that the two that we see most often, number one would be, and this may sound crazy, but you'd be amazed how many presentations you go through without a clear understanding of what it is the company does, right? There's so much over contextualizing around the market, around the opportunity. There is not a clear understanding of what it is that the company does, who it serves, and why it's differentiated, right? These sort of core parts of the deck are things that you often don't see. I think the other thing that we see quite often is, and again, this may sound a bit specific, but it's really critical, is data without context. I think what ends up happening in developing a presentation is you say, okay, this is my rough story. Here's where I talk about traction. These are the 10 or 11 data points that I want to share. And you end up sharing them in a way that doesn't feel coherent, doesn't tell a story, and leaves the investor doing their own work to try to understand how is this company performing. And so I think what you end up with in a lot of cases is, I often describe it as sort of a term paper, right? You spend all of this time putting together all the content that you need. You don't take the step back to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the investor to say, does this feel like a coherent flow? Are they going to follow this? Am I telling them the things that I want to tell them, as opposed to letting them draw their own conclusions?
Now, Jared, I find that fascinating because the first point you made had to do with over contextualizing, throwing too many things at them. And the second one was data without context. So actually the two ends of the poles in terms of context. And so really what you're talking about, what I'm hearing from you is balance and understanding sort of the art of when to add more information and when to strip back. Does that sound right?
That's exactly right. And I think it's really understanding your own company, understanding the investor. What is their base of knowledge going in? What are the areas where you need to dig in? And what are the areas where you don't? And that's always the big part of our early part of our process, is understanding who is the target investor, sort of building up that archetype or that profile. How much information do they have? How much information do they need? What are their biases likely to be, to make sure that you, to the extent that you are providing a ton of context, it's in areas where they need it.
Got it. All right, let's get specific. I know you have some slides that you can share, which it felt appropriate in a presentation like this for you to actually share a couple slides, even though we don't normally do that on fireside chats. But to help us understand what are the building blocks of a great deck, I read a piece by you online about how you prefer to think about decks in acts, 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 versus slides themselves. So maybe you could explain that concept, and then you can show us show us an act or two.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what people often do, right, when it's time to work on their presentation is, first of all, you'll go to Google and you'll find what is the sort of 10 slides that I need in my deck, or like the 11, critical slides, right? There's basically all of these templates that are out there. And what I can tell you is either one of them is right or none of them are right. And I tend to think that probably none of them are right, because every presentation, every company is unique. The idea that, market size should always be slide 2 doesn't make a ton of sense if you're operating in a gigantic market. I think people understand that it's a big market. There's probably something else to cover before that. And so often people will start with a template, or, they'll go super deep into this notion of storytelling, right? Start thinking about the hero's journey. What is the rising action, the climax, the denouement, right? Trying to build a pitch that way. And what I can tell you is if you try to put a denouement in your pitch, you probably lost your investor an hour ago. And so what we started to do is think about this less in terms of what are the plot points, or rather what is the beats in the story, but rather in terms of acts. And I actually do have a slide or two on that, if that's all right with you. So these are essentially the 3 acts that we prescribe. Number 1 is making your case, right? And I'll talk just briefly about what that means. Act 2 is where you de-risk your approach. So once you've sort of made a case for why you are not just a well-performing company, but a great investment, showing all the things that potentially could be a challenge, and dismissing those challenges. And then thirdly, broadening the case, right? This is what matters to investors. Not that they're investing in a company that's growing, 2x or 3x year over year, although that's what, that's a pretty good start, but rather that this is the type of investment that's going to return their fund. And so closing the presentation with exactly how you do that is what we recommend to kind of do third. So just very briefly, right? What do we mean by making your case, right? Our belief is that within the first 5 minutes or less of your pitch, you've got to demonstrate a couple of things. Number 1 is a deep understanding of your market, right? Their investors are looking for somebody who's not only in a large market, but really understands it, has a deep knowledge of it, and keen insights into it. A really clear explanation of your product or service, what it does and what makes it differentiated, and sharing some signals of success. In some cases, that is traction, right? At earlier stages, that might be product milestones. What are the things that you've done that show that you are delivering on that promise? And if it looks like this is a lot to cover in the first 4 or 5 minutes, it is, right? Which is why we spend a good 75% of our time often working on the first 25% of the deck. Because this is really what sets the framing for what it is that what it is that you're presenting to the investor and why they should be excited about it.
Jared, any other common pitfalls for that section of the presentation?
Yeah, I would say that I think when you talk about market, for instance, right, relying on a market size, for instance, a large number that comes from Gartner, right, might be useful, but it's easy to dismiss, right? What you're looking for is let's go a step deeper. Right? What makes that market tick? What are the underserved areas of that market? Why is this market going to grow? These are the types of questions that you want to be answering at that stage, as opposed to simply trying to check a box that, hey, I'm in a big market. And then the question is, how do you go about this? Right? There's a million ways to what is slide 1, right? Is often the question that people have. And so one of the things you referenced this article that we wrote with Stripe Atlas a couple of years back, where we put together what we call pitch plots, which are pretty common story frameworks that we've seen over the years that apply to different types of stories. And so what I would recommend, we don't need to go through them here, but check out the piece. And I think what you'll find is you can take your story, you can work through all of these beats, these sort of familiar stories, and try to get to one that feels natural. And that's often a good starting point. For you to start working through your deck and then trying to go back through the checklist to say, did I do everything that we just saw on that previous slide? Act 2, when we talk about de-risking your approach very quickly, right? One of the things that we do at the very beginning of all of our processes is we sit down with founders and we ask, okay, what are the problems, right? What are the issues that an investor is going to have? What are the tough questions that they're going to ask? And how do we overcome them? So if you are in a market where customer acquisition, for instance, is very expensive, you need to find a way to demonstrate, hey, yes, it is expensive to acquire customers, but they come with a really high LTV, and be able to present that in your pitch, right? If you, for instance, if you might be in a market, I'm sure this is common in healthcare, where, hey, there's probably about 20 people in the world that could be a customer of our product, but hey, we've got 18 of them in the pipeline. Similarly, you might be an inexperienced founder. I doubt that's common for anyone on this call, but emphasizing your leadership team. So going through all of the things that could be seen as risks in your company, and finding the right way to address those risks proactively. And then there's the process of determining how much of this do I need to put in the deck, how much of this do I put in the appendix. But all of this is part of working through that de-risking section of your presentation. And also, this is where you typically find a lot of the metrics, right, for the company.
How do you think through what goes in the main versus the appendix? Sometimes that's a challenge to know how much to include. You want it to be something you can leave behind or that they'll get right away. So you don't want to miss out on any data.
It's a great question, and my general rule of thumb is don't answer questions that haven't been asked. Right. In other words, if you expect, okay, someone is going to have this question on their mind, right? There is this burning question that every investor I've ever talked to always asks me. Well, that's one that needs to be addressed in the main portion of the deck, and it needs to be done proactively because you need to control that part of the conversation. But if you're really mining and digging for risks and you find yourself, hey, I'm introducing risks that nobody has ever really identified before, well, those are great for the appendix because if you thought of that question, somebody might. And so you want to be prepared to answer that question with a slide. But that's the type of thing you don't necessarily need in the main body of your presentation. And speaking to metrics, right, as you guys know, every vertical, every industry has its own set of headline metrics. It's important to understand what is it that investors are looking at. And of course, this evolves over time, right? The metrics that matter in SaaS, for instance, seem to change every 6 months. So being on top of what it is that and how investors are evaluating companies in your space, asking around, what are the numbers people want to see, and making sure that you're including that in that midsection of the presentation. And then finally, is this notion of broadening your case, right? Often what this means is you want to show people that you are on the precipice of exponential growth, or even if you are not personally on that path, that your market is. Right? Or that you have the opportunity, for instance, here's a common type of slide you might see that, hey, look, right now we're operating in this market that's 1.5 billion. We introduced this new feature in 2023, and that opens us up to this $10 billion market. And by the way, that market is growing, 5 times year over year. By 2030, we're operating in this $150 billion market. And if we continue growth on the path we're on, we're $1 billion company by 2025. Right. These are the types of, this is what you want to leave investors thinking at the end of the pitch, because again, right, they're not investing in cool technology. They're investing in companies that have billion-dollar exit potential.
Let's shift our focus, Jared. You just presented a beautiful looking deck as well as a compelling one. I think folks are thinking about the production side of this as well. And they're thinking, okay, well, that's great. You have a fancy agency behind you that can design these things, that can develop these things, and it's not cheap. So let's talk about your advice for a founder, how they think through, let's say they've got a limited team, limited funds, and they want to build something like this out and they can't go to an agency. We can also talk about next kind of how your agency does work, but assuming an early stage founder needs to do it themselves, let's talk about some of the structures that you would suggest.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my first piece of advice, and this is not self-serving, if you can afford a designer, I promise you will get value out of that. Specifically, if you can find a presentation designer who, it's a slightly different discipline from traditional graphic design, and there's plenty of them out there. But I assure you, if you have the money, it's worth the investment. But I recognize that that's not always the case.
What is the best way to find a good presentation designer?
I wish there was a better way, but reach out to me and we can connect you to some great folks, whether it's us or someone else. In fact, my co-founder Chris runs an underground Slack channel of about 150 really talented presentation designers. So we've got a nice channel there. But it's a growing discipline. I'm not a designer myself, but I think people are recognizing just how important this is, and I think founders will find that to be the case as well. Now, how do you do this if you don't have access to a designer? my first piece of advice is there are a couple of activities that you can go through, at least start working through the story. Um, the first is we talked about this notion of de-risking, understanding what are the risks that your company is likely to face, or at least investors are likely to perceive. We go through an activity with all of our clients that we call burning questions. And this is the first thing we do with every client, which is we talk to their existing investors, which you guys can do as well, of course. And we say, tell us what it was that got you really excited about the company. Now, what are the opportunities? What are the challenges likely to be in this next round? What are the really hard questions that this sort of Series A or Series B investor is likely to ask? And we put all of those questions up on a board, or at least we used to when we would be in person. Now we do it slightly differently. And we spend a good 2 or 3 hours working through the answers to those slides, to those questions. And what we find is that once you have answered all of those questions or figured out where are we going to get the answers to those questions, then you can start prioritizing. Okay, these are really burning questions that we're going to have to address in the pitch. These are the things that maybe we can start to put in the appendix. And now you start to have a collection of content, a collection of slides that you can start shifting and moving around. The next thing you want to focus on is what is the actual narrative? So we talked about the pitch plots exercise as a way to start thinking through this. There's a number of other things that we do to start getting the juices flowing, to start thinking about story. But you really want to get into this mode of structuring your slides into a story as quickly as you can. I think a lot of people, the instinct is to do outlines or to start writing in prose. It's counterintuitive, but our belief is you want to get into slides as quickly as you can, right? You want to start, even if it just means here's the headline for this slide, here's the headline for the next slide, and then you go back and you start filling in the content from your burning questions activity onto each of those slides. But you really want to, this is a presentation. It's going to be consumed as a presentation. It's in your best interest to start treating it like one as soon as you can. As far as design itself, there are some basic principles that are going to be useful to you in building out slides. I would recommend, for instance, a book called Slideology by Nancy Duarte. It's to be honest, I haven't looked at it in about a decade. I don't know if the principles are dated at this point, but it was really, when I got into this, her book, both that book, and she also wrote a book on storytelling in presentation form called Resonate, which was actually quite transformational for me. I think really understanding what are the basic principles of design is going to be really valuable to you. But I don't think you have to feel an onus to have your presentation look as slick as something you might see, for instance, at Dreamforce. But really, basic things like we want to keep as little content per slide as possible. You're better off having more slides with less content, for instance, than you are with 10 bullets on a slide. I think all of these things were valuable or novel design principles 10 years ago. I think people tend to understand this now. But really always being able to take a step back, looking at each individual slide and saying, does this pass the comprehension test? Is this something that people can really understand? And also understanding the balance between what I'm planning to say and what I'm planning to show. And recognizing that some of the things that you might put on a slide are things that you would say and don't necessarily need to be on there. Also thinking about your data, for instance. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Jared, that's actually a perfect segue to one of our questions in the chat. But we will get back to what you were about to say just now. But let's take a couple questions just because they popped in and they're very relevant to your conversation. Howard Rosen, if you can come off of mute, you can start.
Sure. Hey, Jared, this is great. And you were just leading into exactly my question was, which is why Logan used the segue, was really how to differentiate between a presentation deck and a leave behind deck. Because sometimes you got to leave something behind and they're going to share it with their team and they've not had the benefit of your presentation. Because that's, an eternal question we always have is you want graphics, you want to look good, but you want to make sure there's the explanation when you're there versus when you're just leaving it behind to be taken out of context.
It's a great question. And in fact, what we often say is there are really 4 versions of the presentation, right? The first is the send ahead, right? That's the version of the presentation that you are using to generate interest, right? That's often something that we expect investors are going to be looking through quickly, right? So we're often taking the best of from the presentation that we have. So there's that deck. There's, of course, what we would call the partner deck, which is where you're really diving deep with folks who understand the space. where you're thinking, okay, this is maybe a 20 to 30-minute presentation. It's got a huge appendix where we're answering questions. You've then got the partnership deck, right? Where now you're talking to a broader set of folks, some of whom are not as well initiated. You're leaning on the partner to say, okay, what do I need to emphasize with the partnership? And then you've got the send ahead. Obviously, the biggest difference across those four presentations is that the send ahead, and the leave behind. The send ahead and the leave behind are presentations that people have to read. And so as you're thinking through what goes in there, in the leave behind, what we often find is really the easiest way to do this is to look at your headlines. That's step one, right? If you have a slide where you feel like, okay, the visual does tell the story, let's use the headline space to deliver the key message of that slide, right? You almost think about you're reading it like a book, from one headline to the next. So we often go in and we're, for leave behind or send ahead versions, that's the first thing we do is rewriting the headlines so that it's sort of the key takeaway is there. And if somebody only read the headlines, they would get a sense of the story you're trying to tell. And then it's also looking at the data, for instance, right? There are charts where you're providing the context when you're presenting them, right? It might be, hey, you can see the slope in the chart that starts in March. That was when we hired our first salesperson. If you're not in the room, you better annotate that part of the chart and say, this is when we hired our first salesperson. So really putting yourself in the investor's shoes and saying, am I going to be able to follow this without someone in the room? But the actual content of the presentation, I would say the send ahead, as I said, is often the best of, and the leave behind tends to be the exact presentation that you sent, just with any necessary context added back in. One kind of tip that I would give you with respect to send aheads, and again, a lot of these are sort of minor. They feel very minor, but they go a long way. If you're going to send a deck ahead, first of all, it should not be the exact same deck you present, right? Because otherwise, what's the point? It should be kind of an abbreviated version of it. But also, you should never use the same first slide in the presentation you send ahead versus the presentation that you deliver in person. And the reason for that is if you send somebody a presentation, they've read it, they've made their notes, they have their questions and their issues locked and loaded. And so the second you start presenting, when they see something familiar, they'll ambush you, is often what we found. But if you can disarm them with a first slide that's different, and kind of come at the story in a slightly different way, that puts them on their heels. And you've earned yourself at least a couple of minutes for them to listen. So just something to think about as you're putting those different presentations together.
These are great strategies, Jared. I'm learning a ton. I have to ask though, with 4 versions of a presentation deck, give us some strategies for just organizing all of this information, because you make one update over here and you got to make it over here. And is there a SaaS platform that you use for this, or what do you do?
Well, it's a question of sequencing, right? Which presentation do you build first? And we often find that focusing on the partnership deck is a great place to start, because there you're talking about obviously an investor who is sophisticated, but may not necessarily be an expert in your particular space. If you're going to a generalist investor, for instance, obviously, if you guys are pitching healthcare-focused investors, everyone in the room is likely has some knowledge of your space. But we often find that that's a great middle ground, a great place to start. Once you get that presentation locked and you feel really comfortable around it, then you're pivoting off of that to build some of these other presentations, right? You have that deck and you're saying, okay, what's the 8 to 10 slide version of this that we can use as the send ahead? How do we take this and then convert it for the leave behind? What additional context am I going to need when I get in front of, the real expert in the room? So I think for us, it's really getting that first presentation in a great spot, and not just, okay, the slides are done, but I can present this thing. I can actually stand up and deliver it coherently. The story works. It makes sense. Now we have something that we can build off of. So yes, it is difficult to sort of do all of that version control. But the key is really getting that core presentation done and having you be comfortable with it before you start building anything else.
Are there any technology platforms that make that version control easier that you've used, or you just got to stay organized with your files?
Yeah, I mean, we are working generally in the traditional presentation software that have their strong limitations. There are folks who will use DocSend, for instance, as a way to keep their presentations updated. But yeah, there's nothing specific that we use.
That's a good segue to talking about platforms. People often get kind of befuddled trying to decide whether to use PowerPoint, Keynote, Canva, even there's a lot of new SaaS platforms that are popping up. Beautiful, is that one of them? So maybe you could talk to some of the available platforms and pros and cons.
I mean, I think everyone who's worked in PowerPoint is always looking for an alternative. But I often find they find their way back because what you get out of PowerPoint, of course, is flexibility. I mean, the three core platforms that we're working with typically are PowerPoint, Keynote, or Google Slides. That's 98% of the cases, and really, it's personal preference. As far as design is concerned, I think most designers will tell you they prefer to work in Keynote, but most of us are not designers. The benefits really are in workflow, I found, right? So Keynote and Google Slides are really great for collaboration. Some people don't realize or don't know this, but Keynote really has real-time collaboration, just like Google Slides. So you can work with other folks, you can see changes in real time. So often we recommend if that's a priority, those are great platforms. PowerPoint, again, it's just the default for everybody, and they're used to using it. And so we default to that as well. I think some of the newer platforms can be great from a design perspective. If you're talking about, say, a beautiful AI or a pitch, a lot of them will do the work for you, where you essentially say, hey, I'm building a team slide with 4 people, and it'll automatically lay out the slides for you. So things like that can be really useful. But often, with pitches where you do need to get specific, it often lacks the flexibility that you need. So I would encourage people to try them, to test them out. We see a lot of decks, for instance, built in beautiful AI, and some of these other platforms as well. But really, we see people, what they want to go into Figma, they want to use all kinds of other things. The key is, can you produce a great PDF really out of it? And can you do it in a way that you feel comfortable that you can continue to make changes over time? So it's a matter of personal preference, but there's options out there.
Do you think there's any major cons to using a more templatized system like Beautiful AI or even Canva to, let's say you're getting 100 decks and you're reviewing them and they start to all look the same? Is that a pitfall?
Yeah, and I mean, we say that all the time. If you're using a pitch formula, for instance, right? Like, hey, here's the template for slide 1, slide 2, and so on. If you're using a formula, you're going to end up with a formulaic pitch. The same is true from a design perspective, right? If you're using a template, you're going to end up with something that looks fairly templatized. Although, look, your job here is to tell a great story. You should not be pushing pixels at 2:00 in the morning, in PowerPoint. So you need to make that decision as a founder. How do you want to spend your time? Yeah. But you also, if you do have designers on staff, I would encourage you to leverage them as well.
How do you think through that process? Let's say that you are stuck pushing pixels at 2 a.m. and you need to recalibrate and you need to get back to the story. What are some strategies for kind of getting your team to rethink the whole pitch process and get into story mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier. I think that it's a great activity to kind of treat your slide canvas in presentation software as essentially cards for an outline, and write your headlines down. Literally one idea per slide, and start to kind of put those up on the wall. Figure out what is the right sequence, what's missing from here, what's the most compelling way for us to make this point. I mentioned that you should be in presentation software. This is a way to stay in presentation software and do outlining. It's what I do with every single pitch. I don't write in prose. I open up PowerPoint. I say, okay, I want to make this point. Okay, I have to make this point as well. Okay, now I've got to make this point. I want to make sure I cover this. And then I start mixing and matching and moving things around.
When is it okay to go incredibly minimal? We've seen some great decks, some great presentations. I'm thinking of Apple, where it's just words on a color, And so oftentimes I'll see founders say, well, if I don't have a designer, I'm just going to go incredibly, incredibly simple. When is that okay?
It's funny, we come from a world, my co-founder and I, where we would build those slides, right? We would build, for 80-foot screens, this one beautiful image. And we would also do a lot of work with animation, right? And video. And we had to train that out of ourselves, because I think there is this balance with an investor pitch. I totally believe that it is universal that nobody wants to read a pitch where each slide has 15 to 20 bullets on it and 3 charts on a slide. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody can really get anything out of that presentation. But at the same time, you're making a pitch for an investment, right? You're not trying to connect with someone's hearts and mind. You're trying to connect with their pocketbook. And so I think that you do have to walk that balance, which is not to say that there aren't really great opportunities, right? If you are, for instance, if you are a consumer brand, leveraging photos of people and doing things like that can be really powerful. Even in more content dense slides like case studies, sort of showing real people can be effective. But this idea of just sort of having one word against the color on a slide, you better have a really good reason to do it.
Yeah.
In a pitch deck.
If it's just one word on a slide, it better be a really good word, right?
Or a really big number, that helps.
A really big number. I want to hear from more people on the call. I know you folks have questions about their own decks, things that have worked or haven't worked. So please drop it can get granular. This is your chance to really talk strategy with the best in the business. Jared, while they're doing that, I want to talk about recession proofing your deck and how one might think about reimagining their narrative in the context of a more risk-averse investor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we went through this, we've gone through this a couple times now, right? As you can imagine, at the very beginning of the pandemic, every project we were in the middle of, the founder would come to us and say, every investor is asking me about what the pandemic is going to mean for my business. And then you have to take a step back to say, okay, for your particular vertical or industry, how critical is it really, right? Do you need to lead the pitch with it? Because in some cases you do, right? We were working with a company at the time that was, doing, without giving too many specifics, they were sending people to your house, right? Now, obviously, in early 2020, this was not an option. So for them, they had to make that the foundation of their pitch. They had to address that instantly. The same is true, obviously, for increasing interest rates and anything else that might be impacting a business today. You have to make a decision. Is this something that I need to address? Is this, basically the core of my pitch? You have to make the case right up front that, hey, the world is changing. We're in these challenging times. We can either persevere or it's an advantage to us. Or is it something that really falls into that de-risking part of the presentation? Hey, look, the business is doing really well. It's going to continue to grow. One concern you might have is what happens, in an environment X, Y, and Z, or an inflationary environment, whatever it might be. That's something we're going to address a little bit later in the pitch. So obviously, as an investor, it's top of mind. The question for you is, where do you need to address it? And do you want to make it so fundamental to your pitch that it's what you end up talking about at the end of the pitch, or is it something that you want to just make sure you're dismissing at some point later on?
Trend-wise, are you finding that people are more successful if they address it head on?
It really depends on the company, and it depends on how their industry is impacted. I think in healthcare, for instance, there are going to be some areas where the environment we're in is going to slow down sales cycles significantly. In others, right, where you're selling technology to hospitals, for instance, and I'm talking about my pay grade here, it might be, hey, this is less important, right? People are going to have to buy technology one way or another. They'll figure out how to finance it. So it's really not that relevant to us. So I think it really does depend on who you are as a company, and there are errors you can make on both sides, right? You can make it an issue when it's not, or you can downplay it too much.
Yeah, it kind of gets into the issue of just how much detail do you go into about your the challenges that you face, and like you said, potentially creating issues that weren't there already. Right. Let's go to a question from the chat from Sydney Collin from Deoro Devices. Sydney, you can come off of mute and go ahead and ask.
Thanks, Logan. Thank you, Jared. This is super helpful to see and to kind of go through. So my question, and I'll start broad and maybe get more specific, but my question generally is how, if ever, do you integrate videos into a slide deck? And the reason that I bring that up is we have a mobility aid that allows people with Parkinson's who experience freezing of feet to be able to walk. And I think it's really impactful for people to see, like, there's only so much that I can do to explain that a green laser line and a metronome allows someone to be able to walk who couldn't before. But showing them a video of, okay, here someone can't walk, here somebody can walk, I think creates a lot more kind of knowledge and understanding there, and is much more impactful.
Yeah.
However, I, sometimes struggle with having videos in the presentation. So I just wanted to kind of understand what your perspective was.
No, it's a great question. What we often say is, I think what doesn't work is hitting play and then all watching the video together. I think it creates kind of an awkward experience, especially on Zoom. It's a bit weird. But there are two options. Number one, if you believe that they will do it, is sending the video in advance so that they have that context. The other option is you can show it in the room, but you just have to make sure you're narrating it, right? That you're explaining what's actually happening in the video. And that means rehearsing. It's the same way with a demo, right? It means rehearsing your talk track alongside the video so that it's exactly the same length, right? There aren't these sort of gaps where no one's talking and then you pick something up again. You have to rehearse that the same way you would rehearse the pitch itself. It's got to feel like another slide, right? It's just a moving slide. So that's what we've seen be successful. And it shouldn't be too long, right? If you can sort of show this in a minute or so and you're talking over the entire thing and you're explaining in detail, here's what's happening here, here's why they're able to do this, here's the technology behind it, I think it can be very effective.
I feel like this goes back to your wisdom about a single word on a page. It's got to be a pretty compelling word, or strong data point. So, the video has to work. It really has to be a great clip.
Right. And same is true with the demo, right? Often people say, oh, do we have to show a demo? Well, is the demo going to blow people away? Or is the demo going to do exactly what people expect it to do?
Right.
And if it's going to do exactly what people expect it to do, maybe you don't need to show it.
Let's go to a question from Michael from Augmental Tech. Michael, you can come off mute and ask your question.
Cool. Hey guys, greetings from Stellenbosch, South Africa.
Nice to see you.
Quick, same here. Thanks for the session, Jared. It's really insightful. Quick question from my side is something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment. And I'm hoping there's some best practices, but is in a single slide, what would you suggest is some of the best ways to showcase your product's differentiation?
Now, you're talking about competitive differentiation?
Correct.
Yeah. So competition is a challenging thing. And it's going to be different for every company again, but a couple of frameworks that we see, I think where people tend to go is the 4 boxes, right? And surprise, surprise, we're in the top right and everyone else is in the bottom left. And I think those are difficult for people to make much sense of. So what we often recommend instead is, let's do a creative grouping of the companies that are in the space or the products that are in the space. So if you would say there's a handful of companies, for instance, that lack functionality X, or let's put those all in one group and explain what it is that they're missing. Maybe there's a group of tech where the technology is there, but the business model doesn't work. Let's group those. You have to give investors a framework think about like, how are they going to explain it to somebody else? They say, why is this company different? Oh, well, the one you've heard of, they have this issue. The one that you've heard of, they have this issue. So you're giving them that framework for understanding, competitive differentiation is often really useful. And it also demonstrates your expertise in the space, that you've created this grouping and you understand the market, as opposed to a list of features or trying to put yourself in the top right of a 4 box.
Now, and presenting that grouping in your mind, what have you seen works if you have those groups?
Let's just say it is a set of companies. I think what you want to do is show them, right? The reason why you do differentiation is because you think an investor might have a preconceived idea that some other company either does exactly what you do or does it better than you, right? That's the reason why. And so the logos of those companies should be on the slide. So typically you want to sort of maybe give a name to the challenge that those companies have, right? These are sort of the tech laggards, right? And here's the 3 logos, and then here's a brief description of what it is that they all lack, and in common, not one by one, right? Here's another group of so and so. So I think giving that language to people that they can repeat, I think is really useful, and making sure that the companies that they expect to see on that slide are on it and they're addressed.
You mentioned before about rehearsing over a video, making sure that it's just really seamless. And that just got me thinking about rehearsal in general and kind of how you work with companies. A lot of founders, are good speakers, and so they think they can just wing it. They're like, yeah, I got this. I understand my company really well. So talk us through some strategies about rehearsal and really that the verbal presentation side, in person versus Zoom too.
Yeah. No, rehearsal is one of our favorite topics. It's one of the hardest things to get our clients to do, but we build it in every one of our processes. And we even tell people we will do as many of these as you will allow us to do with you. Right. Like it's that important to us. And the general rule of thumb, we say, basically, if you have a 12-slide presentation, 20-slide presentation, you should be spending at least an hour per slide. That doesn't mean an hour on each slide, but as a general rule of thumb, 15-slide presentations, you should be rehearsing for 15 hours to really deliver it really cleanly. Now, who do you ask for feedback is also incredibly important, and when do you ask for feedback? So we start with when. Asking for feedback when the presentation is still really messy and you can't present it is going to get you all the wrong kinds of feedback, right? Presenting it too late when you feel like it's all buttoned up and it's perfect is going to make you resistant to make changes. So you have to get to a point where you say, okay, maybe the presentation isn't fully designed, but the flow is right and I can present the hell out of it. And then you're ready to go get feedback, because that's when you start to get really useful feedback. Like, hey, I didn't quite understand your point about X, or, I understand why you went there, but I think there's probably a more compelling data point for that. And that's really useful, which brings us to who you ask. People like to, they'll sort of ask their entrepreneur friends, or they'll ask people in their company for feedback. What you're looking for, if you can find it, is someone who is a proxy for that next round investor. Ideally, it's somebody is a friendly who or somebody within a fund that might have invested in your company, where you can turn to and say, look, you've invested in companies at this stage I'm looking to raise capital in. Can you tell me what you think of this pitch? And the question you ask at the end of the pitch is also really, really important. If you finish your pitch and you say, what do you think? You're going to get things like, oh, I think you should reverse slide 4 and slide 5, or I think I didn't really love the color on this slide. So what we always say is ask the question, would you invest? Because you're going to get a very different answer. You're going to get one of 3 answers, either yes, in which case your pitch is great, move forward. You're going to get the answer, yes, but only, right? Yes, but only if you could overcome this objection, or yes, but only if you could help me understand this a little bit better, or no, because, right? No, I wouldn't, because I just can't get past this market's too small. Or no, because you've got this competitor who's crushing you and I just don't see how you guys overcome it. Those are the types of things that you now know, okay, this is what I have to overcome in my pitch, and this is really worthwhile feedback. So it's really a matter of when you ask and who you ask and what you ask in gathering feedback, once you feel like you're ready to pitch this thing confidently.
That's great advice, Jared. I see a lot of pens going and fingers typing. Do you ever have people record themselves and watch themselves back? Is that valuable?
It can be. I mean, I think what we find is that everybody's different. When we work with founders, there are some founders where I'll record a loom of myself delivering the pitch, and then they'll internalize it and then sit down and rewrite the script in their own words. And that's a great way for them to learn. We have others like myself who, when I present, I don't have notes. I literally just say it over and over and over again. I'll say, okay, let me get the first 5 slides. Great, I've got those locked. Let me work on 6 through 10, got those down, and then put the whole thing together. You have folks like my partner, Chris, who he will basically write down his script word for word. And then every time we rehearse, he'll take a few words out till at the end, his notes are just, one 3 bullets, 1 word each on every single slide. Everyone's going to do this a different way. But the key is just to keep doing it, right? If it helps you to record it and watch yourself back, don't just do it once. Record it, watch yourself back, take notes on what works, do it again. Make sure you think you got better the second time. It's really a matter of repetition, just like anything else.
That's great. We'll take one more question, and then if anyone wants to drop an insight into the chat, I can call on them just as a way to reflect back to the group, something that you've heard, you've appreciated. Shireen, I see your hand, so I'll call on you in a second. But first, we'll go to Jamie Edwards from our team. Jamie, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Jared, amazing session so far, man. Thank you so much for sharing this information with our health transformers. I know everyone's getting a ton out of this. Are there any common sense tips, like something that's just so counterintuitive you think has such a big impact in presentations, whether it's the way somebody presents, the concept of like, are we making friends during a presentation, or are we planting a flag on a belief? Is there anything like that you've come across? You're like, over my years of doing this, there's one or two things that you just think are key that you normally wouldn't think of.
Yeah, let's see. So to those things specifically, are we making friends? I think that what we have found, and maybe this is not counterintuitive, but you work with enough investors, they don't necessarily have to agree with you to invest in you, right? And in fact, they have to believe that, hey, maybe this person's got a better idea than me. And so having the confidence to stand up for your beliefs, I think there's an instinct when someone asks a question or challenges you and say, I feel like maybe this other go-to-market might make sense. You want to say, oh, that's interesting. That's something we can look into. But I think that's often interpreted as, okay, this person doesn't really have a clear vision here. If I can I've been looking at this company for 10 minutes and I'm knocking them off of their plan. But being prepared, instead saying, yeah, we looked at that. Here's why it doesn't work, right? And this is not confrontational. This is just confident. And so I think if you walk away from a pitch feeling like, man, I kind of sparred with that person, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Great question, Jamie. Shireen from Yumlish, you raised your hand with an insight or a question.
I have a question. So thanks so much, Jared, for your time on this. One of the things that I struggle with is sometimes to structure that very short initial 30-minute conversation, right? So of course, there's the slides starting out, maybe some intros, go right into the slides. How would you say to format sort of that tight 30 minutes with getting the point across, but then also having enough time to sort of further explore next steps and interest?
Yeah, and I think this question is a great one, and it kind of ties in a bit to the evolution and the way that we're pitching now, with so much of this happening in Zoom. One of the things we've been hearing from investors, whereas we used to have a slide that said, hey, your pitch should be 20 minutes long, leaving 40 minutes for conversation. That number's dropped like 3 times in the last 2 years, where now we're hearing investors saying, hey, in fact, send me the deck in advance and then pitch me a 10-minute version when we chat, and then let's just talk. Because I think it's awkward to kind of sit and watch a presentation on Zoom. But a question of how do you structure those 12 minutes? I mean, that's all we do. So it's hard to answer that question quickly. But I think being really ruthless in what is it that I need to make sure he or she, this investor, understands before they ask their first question. And your job should really be to get that out. Because even if you prepare a 10-minute pitch, even the odds that you get through that are quite low, right? Because investors will stop you with questions. So we talked about over-contextualization, right? There's this sense when you're doing storytelling, okay, I've got to build to what's really exciting. It's a little different in pitch decks. You've got to hit that exciting point on slide 1 or slide 2. So making sure that if you say, hey, if I get cut off at minute 3, have I said the most important things? And I know that's much easier said than done, but it's something to keep asking yourself, right? If you sort of feel like, hey, this really punchy moment that I think is really important to conveying my message happens on slide 12, you may never get there.
Jared, we are nearing the top of the hour. I want to give you just 60 seconds to have the final word, piece of advice, parting wisdom for the founders on the call about nailing that next presentation.
Sure. Well, thank you guys so much again. I didn't really get to say this earlier, but I am a healthcare nerd myself. I used to. One of my first jobs was I managed a newsletter covering a very obscure healthcare law called the 340B program, which some of you may be familiar with. And that was back when newsletters actually were newsletters. I had to print them and mail them to people. So this is exciting for me. But look, fundraising, I think there was too much messaging during the pandemic that, hey, move fast because the money's out there. And fundraising is easy. Fundraising was not easy before. It was not easy, 2 years ago, and it's certainly not easy now. And it's easy for me, frankly, to tell you, hey, here's how to build a great pitch deck and go out and raise a round. But the fact of the matter is it's just perseverance, right? I mean, rounds are closing slower, certainly, than they did over the last couple of years. And I think it's easy to get discouraged. But just remember, it often takes dozens of conversations to find the one person who's there to lead you around. And so just continuing to feel like, hey, I believe in this story. If not everyone does, I'm just going to keep telling it. Of course, you're making changes along the way, but I'm going to keep telling this story until I find the right person, and trying not to ultimately be too hard on yourself. You know, if you believe in the company and if you believe in the story you're telling, someone will too.
Jared, great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today. Just so much to think about. I love that you gave us some books to read. I'm going to be checking out Slideology and Resonate, and diving deeper into this topic. So Jared, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for sharing all your wisdom. I see a lot of thank yous going into the chat right now. And thank you to all the health transformers on the call. This was one of our best attended fireside chats ever. Great questions, and just great to see all of your faces.
Thanks for listening to Startup Health Now. Startup Health invests in health transformers around the world who are dedicated to achieving audacious health moonshots. If you want to learn how you can join this community of entrepreneurs, or if you want to connect with one of our 400 companies, go to startuphealth.com. If you'd like to learn how you can invest in our Health Moonshot Impact Fund, go to healthmoonshots.com. Thanks for listening to Startup Health Now. We'll be back again with another episode next week.